Sarah Matthews clutched her coffee cup tighter as she stared out the diner window at the endless stretch of Wyoming plains. 3 months ago, she had been living in a cramped Manhattan apartment, working 16-hour days at a prestigious law firm. Now she found herself in Cedar Ridge, population 847, wondering how her life had taken such a dramatic turn. The bell above the diner door chimed, and Sarah glanced up to see a tall figure silhouetted against the morning sun. The man who entered wore worn jeans, dusty boots, and a hat that had seen better days. His presence seemed to fill the small space, and several locals nodded respectfully in his direction. This had to be Jake Morrison, the rancher she'd heard whispered about since her arrival. Jake removed his hat, revealing dark hair and weathered features that spoke of long days under the harsh sun. His eyes swept the diner before landing on Sarah, the only unfamiliar face in the crowd. For a moment their gazes locked and Sarah felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. She quickly looked away, focusing on her half-eaten breakfast. "You must be the city lawyer everyone's talking about," Jake said, sliding uninvited into the booth across from her. His voice carried a slight drawl that seemed to wrap around each word like honey. Sarah straightened, her professional demeanor kicking in. "Sarah Matthews. I'm here representing the Hartwell estate." She extended her hand, which Jake took in his calloused grip. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her system. "Jake Morrison. I run the Circle M ranch just outside town." He signaled the waitress for coffee. "Heard you're planning to sell old man Hartwell's place to some development company." The accusation in his tone made Sarah's spine stiffen. "I'm executing my client's wishes according to his will. The property will be sold to the highest bidder." Jake's jaw tightened. That land has been in the Hartwell family for 4 generations. Now some corporation wants to turn it into a shopping center. He leaned forward, his intense gaze never leaving her face. "Do you have any idea what that means to this community?" Sarah had heard variations of this argument from nearly every person she'd met in Cedar Ridge. What they didn't understand was that she was simply doing her job. "Mr. Morrison, I sympathize with your concerns, but I have legal obligations to fulfill." "Legal obligations," Jake repeated, shaking his head. "You sound just like every other suit who's never spent a day working the land." His coffee arrived, and he took a long sip before continuing. "Tell me something, Miss Matthews. What brought you all the way out here? Most lawyers would handle this kind of thing from their fancy offices." Sarah hesitated. The truth was complicated, involving a partner at her firm who had made her life unbearable and a breakdown that had left her questioning everything she thought she wanted. "I needed a change of scenery," she said finally. Jake studied her face as if trying to read the story she wasn't telling. "Running from something?" His perceptiveness caught her off guard. "Aren't we all?" she countered. A smile tugged at the corner of Jake's mouth. "Fair enough." He finished his coffee and stood. "I've got work to do, but this conversation isn't over, Miss Matthews. That land means something to people around here. I hope you'll take the time to understand what before you sign any papers." After he left, Sarah sat alone with her thoughts. She had expected resistance to the sale, but she hadn't expected Jake Morrison. There was something about the rancher that unsettled her carefully constructed walls. She reminded herself that she would be gone within a few weeks. Once all the legal paperwork was completed, the next few days passed in a blur of meetings with potential buyers, document reviews, and phone calls with her firm back in New York. Sarah threw herself into the work, trying to ignore the way the locals looked at her with a mixture of hope and disappointment. They seemed to believe she could somehow save their town, not understanding that her hands were tied by legal requirements. On Thursday evening, Sarah decided to take a walk around the town square. Cedar Ridge was the kind of place she had only seen in movies, with its tree-lined streets and storefronts that looked unchanged since the 1950s. The hardware store, the post office, and Murphy's bar formed the heart of the community. She could see why the residents were fighting so hard to preserve their way of life. As she walked past the old church, she noticed a figure sitting on the steps. Jake Morrison looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. Sarah found herself sitting down beside him, drawn by an impulse she didn't fully understand. "Too much on my mind." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. In Manhattan, Sarah had never been able to see more than a handful of stars through the city lights. Here, the entire universe seemed to unfold above them. I grew up on that land, Jake said quietly. My grandfather and Thomas Hartwell were best friends. Our families worked together during the tough years, helped each other through droughts and market crashes. He turned to look at her. It's not just about money or development. It's about community, about keeping something real alive in a world that seems determined to pave over everything meaningful. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. I understand what you're saying, but I can't change the terms of the will. Thomas Hartwell left specific instructions. Did he? Jake asked. Or did his lawyers interpret his wishes in a way that served their purposes? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been so focused on following the legal documents that she hadn't questioned whether they truly reflected Thomas Hartwell's intentions. What do you mean? Jake stood and extended his hand to help her up. Come with me tomorrow. Let me show you what you're really selling. Sarah knew she should decline. Getting emotionally involved would only make her job more difficult. But as she looked into Jake's eyes, she found herself nodding. One afternoon. But it won't change anything. Jake's smile was soft in the moonlight. We'll see about that, city girl. As Sarah walked back to her hotel, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at a crossroads. The safe path led back to New York, to her old life and all its familiar disappointments. The other path was uncertain, frightening, and somehow infinitely more appealing. She told herself it was just the novelty of small-town life. But deep down, she suspected it had more to do with a certain rancher who challenged everything she thought she knew about herself. Jake arrived at Sarah's hotel the next morning, driving a dusty pickup truck that looked like it had survived several decades of hard work. Sarah had dressed in her most casual clothes, which still looked painfully out of place next to Jake's worn jeans and faded shirt. Ready for a real education counselor? Jake asked as she climbed into the passenger seat. The truck's interior smelled of leather, hay, and something distinctly masculine that made Sarah's pulse quicken. She fastened her seatbelt and tried to focus on the landscape rolling past her window. Where exactly are we going? The Hartwell place first. Then I want to show you something that might change your perspective. They drove in comfortable silence through rolling hills dotted with cattle and wild horses. Sarah found herself relaxing despite her better judgment. There was something peaceful about the vast open spaces that her city-trained mind struggled to comprehend. In New York, she had lived in a world of concrete and steel, where nature was something you visited in Central Park on weekends. The Hartwell property stretched for miles, encompassing meadows, streams, and patches of forest that seemed untouched by time. Jake parked near an old farmhouse that sat on a hill overlooking the valley. Thomas built this place with his own hands, Jake said as they walked toward the house. He and his wife Emma raised 4 children here. When Emma died, he couldn't bear to live anywhere else. Sarah followed Jake onto the wraparound porch, noting the craftsmanship in the wooden railings and the care that had gone into every detail. Through the windows, she could see furniture covered in white sheets, as if the house was simply waiting for its family to return. The development company wants to tear all this down, Jake continued. They're talking about a strip mall, maybe a big box store. Progress, they call it. Sarah walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the valley. It's beautiful, she admitted. But beauty doesn't pay taxes or provide jobs for local families. Jake joined her at the railing, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Doesn't it? This land supports 3 ranching families. The Hartwell place has been leased to local farmers for decades. That's real jobs. Sustainable work that doesn't depend on corporate decisions made in boardrooms thousands of miles away. His words stirred something in Sarah's chest that she didn't want to acknowledge. You're asking me to ignore my legal obligations based on sentiment. I'm asking you to consider that maybe there's more than one way to honor a man's legacy. Jake turned to face her fully. Come on, there's something else I want you to see. They climbed back into the truck and drove deeper into the property. Jake navigated dirt roads with the confidence of someone who had traveled them countless times. Eventually, he stopped near a small grove of trees beside a creek. This is where Thomas proposed to Emma, Jake said as they walked toward the water, and where she's buried. Sarah hadn't known about the grave. She followed Jake to a simple headstone nestled among wildflowers. The inscription read, Emma Hartwell, beloved wife and mother, 1945-2018. Home is where love grows. Thomas came here every week after she died, Jake said quietly. He'd sit by this creek and tell her about his day, about the grandchildren she never got to meet. When he got sick last year, he made me promise to keep an eye on this place. Sarah knelt beside the grave, reading the inscription again. Why didn't the lawyers mention this? Because it doesn't exist on any legal documents. Emma was buried on family land the way people used to do things out here. Jake sat on a fallen log, his expression distant. There's a lot about this place that doesn't show up on surveys or property deeds. The history, the relationships, the promises made between neighbors. Sarah stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. Even if I wanted to help, I don't see how. The will is specific about selling to the highest bidder. Is it? Jake pulled a folded paper from his pocket. I did some research of my own. Thomas's original will was different. It included provisions for keeping the land in agricultural use, protecting the family cemetery, maintaining the house as a historical site. Sarah took the document, her legal training kicking in as she scanned the pages. Where did you get this? Thomas gave it to me 6 months before he died. Said he was worried his nephew might try to change things, so he wanted someone to have a copy of his real wishes. The implications hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. If this was Thomas's true will, then the document she had been working from was either an outdated version or had been deliberately altered. This changes everything, she whispered. Jake stood and moved closer to her. I was hoping you'd say that. For a moment, they stood facing each other beside Emma's grave, the implications of the discovery hanging between them. Sarah could feel her professional world tilting on its axis. If Jake was right, if the will had been tampered with, then her entire understanding of this case was wrong. I need to verify this document, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Compare it with the original filing, check the dates and signatures. I was counting on you being thorough, Jake said with a slight smile. Thomas always said lawyers were like bloodhounds when they caught the scent of something wrong. As they walked back to the truck, Sarah's mind was racing. She would need to contact the probate court, review all the documentation with fresh eyes, possibly involve the State Bar Association if fraud was suspected. It would mean extending her stay in Cedar Ridge indefinitely. Jake, she said as he held the truck door open for her. If this document is authentic, if someone did tamper with Thomas's will, there will be serious consequences. Are you prepared for that kind of fight? Jake's expression was serious as he met her gaze. Miss Matthews, my family has been fighting for this land for 3 generations. I'm not about to stop now. He paused, his voice softening. The question is, are you ready to fight alongside us? Sarah climbed into the truck, her heart pounding with a mixture of professional excitement and personal fear. She was used to fighting battles in boardrooms and courthouses, but this felt different. This felt personal in a way that scared her. As they drove back toward town, Jake glanced at her several times as if trying to read her thoughts. You know, if you decide to pursue this, it could take months to resolve. You'd have to stay in Cedar Ridge a lot longer than you planned. Sarah stared out at the passing landscape, thinking about her empty apartment in Manhattan, her soul-crushing job, and the life she had been so eager to escape. Maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing, she said quietly. Jake's smile was warm as sunlight. No, Miss Matthews. I don't think it would be bad at all. That evening, Sarah spread legal documents across her hotel room bed, comparing dates, signatures, and legal language with the intensity of a detective solving a murder case. The discrepancies were subtle but significant, suggesting sophisticated legal manipulation rather than simple clerical errors. As midnight approached, she realized she was no longer just a lawyer executing a client's will. She had become an advocate for a dead man's true wishes and a defender of a way of life she was only beginning to understand. The thought should have terrified her, but instead, she felt more alive than she had in years. Sarah's phone rang at 7 a.m, jarring her from the first peaceful sleep she'd had in months. The caller ID showed her law firm's number, and she felt her stomach clench with familiar dread. Sarah, what the hell is going on out there? Marcus Webb's voice was sharp with irritation. As senior partner, Marcus had made Sarah's life miserable for the past 2 years. But he was also the reason she had taken this assignment in the first place. Good morning to you, too, Marcus. Sarah sat up in bed, already reaching for the coffee she had learned to prepare the night before. I'm working on some complications with the Hartwell estate. Complications? The buyer is ready to close. All you need to do is sign the papers and get back here. We have the Brennan case starting next week, and I need you focused. Sarah took a sip of coffee, buying herself time to think. There are questions about the validity of the will. I need more time to investigate. Questions? What kind of questions? Sarah, you're not out there to play detective. You're there to execute a simple estate sale. The condescension in Marcus's voice sparked the same anger that had been building for months. The kind of questions that could result in malpractice suits if we ignore them. I've found evidence that suggests the will may have been altered. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Are you certain about this? I'm investigating. But if I'm right, we could be looking at fraud charges against whoever tampered with the original document. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the main street of Cedar Ridge. I need at least 2 more weeks. 2 weeks? Sarah, I don't think you understand the situation here. The partnership decision is coming up in 6 months, and your recent difficulties haven't gone unnoticed. You need to wrap this up and get back here before you do any more damage to your career. The threat was clear. Sarah had been working toward partnership for 5 years, sacrificing her health, her relationships, and her happiness for the promise of security and success. Now Marcus was suggesting that her chance was slipping away. I understand, she said carefully, but I also understand my ethical obligations as an attorney. I'll keep you informed of my progress. After hanging up, Sarah sat in silence for several minutes. The old Sarah would have been on the next plane back to New York, willing to sacrifice anything to protect her career. But something had changed in the past few days. The thought of returning to her sterile office and endless billable hours filled her with dread. A knock at her door interrupted her brooding. She opened it to find Jake standing in the hallway, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing a concerned expression. Thought you might need this, he said, offering her one of the cups. You looked pretty shaken up yesterday after going through all those documents. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, surprised by how natural it felt to have Jake show up at her door. Thank you. That's very thoughtful. Jake studied her face. Everything all right? You look like someone just delivered bad news. Sarah hesitated, then decided honesty was easier than pretense. My boss wants me back in New York. He's not happy about the delays. And what do you want? The simple question caught Sarah off guard. When was the last time someone had asked what she wanted? I want to do the right thing, she said finally. Jake leaned against the doorframe, his presence somehow steadying her racing thoughts. Sometimes the right thing isn't the easy thing. No, it's not. Sarah took a sip of coffee, noting absently that Jake had somehow remembered exactly how she liked it. Jake, if we pursue this investigation, if we prove the will was tampered with, there's going to be a legal battle. It could get ugly. I figured as much. His expression was calm, resolved. Thomas Hartwell was a good man who deserved better than having his final wishes ignored for someone else's profit. If fighting for that means things get ugly, then so be it. Sarah felt a flutter of something that might have been admiration. In her world, people avoided conflict, preferring quiet compromises and backroom deals. Jake's willingness to fight for principle was both refreshing and terrifying. There's something else, she said. If this goes to court, you'll need legal representation. I won't be able to represent both the estate and any interested parties like yourself. Jake nodded thoughtfully. So you're saying you might have to choose sides? I'm saying I might have to choose between doing my job as originally assigned and doing what I believe is right. And which way are you leaning? Sarah met his gaze, seeing something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. Toward trouble, apparently. Jake's smile was slow and warm. Good. I was starting to worry you might be too sensible for your own good. They spent the morning at the courthouse where Sarah requested access to the original probate filing. The clerk, a matronly woman named Helen who had known Thomas Hartwell since childhood, was eager to help once she understood what Sarah was investigating. I always wondered about that, Helen said as she pulled the file. Thomas came in here 3 times to update his will, but the version that got filed was different from what I remembered him talking about. Sarah's heart raced as she compared the courthouse documents with Jake's copy. The differences were subtle but significant. Key clauses about land use and historical preservation had been omitted, and the language about selling to the highest bidder had been strengthened. This is definitely not the same document, Sarah said, pointing out the discrepancies to Jake. Look at the signature dates, and this witness signature doesn't match the others. Jake leaned over her shoulder to examine the papers, his closeness making it difficult for Sarah to concentrate. So what happens now? Now I have to decide whether to file a motion to invalidate the current will or try to work something out privately with the interested parties. What would Thomas want? Sarah looked up at Jake, struck by the question. In her years of practicing law, she had become focused on legal technicalities and procedural requirements. She rarely considered what her clients actually wanted, especially dead ones. He'd want his land protected and his family's legacy preserved, she said slowly. But he'd also want to avoid a circus that tears the community apart. Jake straightened, his expression thoughtful. Then maybe we find a middle way, something that honors his wishes without destroying anyone in the process. That afternoon, Sarah called the development company to arrange a meeting. Their representative, a sharp-dressed man named Peterson who had flown in from Denver, was not pleased with the delay. Ms. Matthews, we have contracts to sign and timelines to meet, Peterson said as they sat in the hotel lobby. Any further delays are going to cost us significant money. Mr. Peterson, I'm sure you understand that legal complications take precedence over business timelines. Sarah kept her voice professional, but she could feel Jake's supportive presence beside her, giving her strength. We've discovered some irregularities in the will that need to be resolved. Peterson's expression hardened. What kind of irregularities? Sarah spread the documents on the table between them. The kind that suggest fraud. The kind that could invalidate any sale based on the current will. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, Sarah saw genuine concern in a businessman's eyes. Peterson studied the documents carefully, his face growing paler with each page. This could tie things up in court for years, he said finally. It could, Sarah agreed, unless we can find a solution that works for everyone involved. Jake spoke up for the first time. What if there was a way to develop part of the land while preserving the historical and agricultural aspects? A compromise that honors Thomas's wishes and still provides economic development for the area? Peterson looked skeptical. What did you have in mind? Sarah felt a surge of pride at Jake's diplomatic approach. We could propose a conservation easement for the most sensitive areas, allow limited development on less critical parcels, and establish a trust to maintain the historical structures. The conversation continued for another hour, with both sides probing for acceptable middle ground. By the end, they had the framework of a potential agreement that could satisfy most of the interested parties. As Peterson left to consult with his company, Jake turned to Sarah with obvious admiration. That was impressive, counselor. You managed to turn a potential disaster into a negotiation. Sarah felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. We make a good team, she said, then immediately regretted the personal implication. Jake's smile was soft. Yes, we do. That evening, as Sarah worked on her laptop in the hotel restaurant, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was shifting in ways she couldn't control. 3 days ago, she had been a burned-out attorney looking forward to a simple assignment and a quick escape. Now she was orchestrating complex negotiations and discovering talents she hadn't known she possessed. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jake. Thank you for fighting for what's right. Thomas would be proud. Sarah stared at the message, feeling something settle into place in her chest. For the first time in years, she was proud of her work too. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hotel parking lot as Sarah loaded her laptop bag into Jake's truck. After 3 days of negotiations and legal research, they had reached a tentative agreement with the development company, but the paperwork required site visits and detailed surveys of the Hartwell property. You sure you're up for a full day in the field? Jake asked as she climbed into the passenger seat. This isn't exactly courtroom work. Sarah had traded her business suits for jeans and boots, though she suspected she still looked like she was playing dress-up. I need to understand every acre if I'm going to make this conservation plan work. Besides, I'm tougher than I look. Jake's grin was infectious. We'll see about that, city girl. They spent the morning walking the property boundaries with a surveyor Jake had hired, marking areas for potential development and identifying sensitive ecological zones. Sarah found herself genuinely fascinated by the land's natural rhythms, the way water flowed through hidden valleys and wildlife moved along established corridors. See that grove of cottonwoods? Jake pointed toward a cluster of trees near the creek. That's been a nesting site for red-tailed hawks for as long as anyone can remember. Thomas used to sit there for hours watching them raise their young. Sarah made notes on her tablet, but her attention was increasingly drawn to Jake himself. She watched the way he moved across the terrain with unconscious grace, how his voice softened when he talked about the land's history, the respect he showed for every living thing they encountered. You really love this place, she observed as they paused for lunch beside the creek. Jake unwrapped sandwiches he had packed, his expression thoughtful. Love is probably too simple a word. This land is part of who I am, part of my family's story. When I was growing up, my grandfather would bring me out here during roundup. He taught me to read the weather, to understand animal behavior, to work with the land instead of against it. Sarah accepted a sandwich, noting how natural it felt to sit beside Jake on the creek bank. What made you stay? You could have done anything, gone anywhere. I tried leaving once, Jake admitted. Went to college in Denver, got a degree in business management. Thought maybe I'd prove I was smart enough for the city. He took a bite of his sandwich, his eyes distant. Lasted 2 years in a corporate job before I realized I was dying inside. The land called me home. Sarah felt a pang of recognition. I know that feeling. The dying inside part anyway. Jake turned to study her face. Is that why you're really out here? Running from a life that wasn't working? Sarah had been avoiding that question even with herself. My boss made a pass at me 6 months ago, she said quietly. When I rejected him, he started making my life hell. Impossible deadlines, public humiliation, threats about my partnership chances. She threw a pebble into the creek, watching the ripples spread. I thought taking this assignment would give me time to figure out my next move. Jake's jaw tightened. And now? Now I'm not sure I want to go back to that world at all. The admission surprised Sarah with its honesty. These past few days working on something that actually matters, it's reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place. Jake reached over and covered her hand with his. Sometimes the best discoveries happen when we're not looking for them. The simple contact sent warmth shooting up Sarah's arm. She found herself studying Jake's weathered hands, the calluses that spoke of honest work, the gentle way he held her fingers as if they were something precious. Jake, she started, then stopped, not sure what she wanted to say. I know, he said softly. I feel it too. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, listening to the water flow over stones and birds calling in the distance. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she had felt so peaceful, so perfectly present in a moment. The sound of an approaching vehicle broke the spell. Jake dropped her hand and stood as a dusty sedan pulled up beside the creek. Sarah recognized Marcus Webb even before he climbed out of the rental car, his expensive suit looking absurdly out of place in the rural setting. Sarah, there you are, Marcus called, his voice carrying its usual note of irritation. I've been trying to reach you all morning. Sarah's stomach clenched as she stood to face her boss. Marcus, what are you doing here? Cleaning up the mess you've created. Marcus barely glanced at Jake, dismissing him as irrelevant. I've been in contact with the development company. They're threatening to pull out of the deal entirely because of these delays. The delays are necessary to ensure legal compliance, Sarah said, falling back on professional language to mask her anxiety. I've discovered evidence of will tampering that could expose the firm to significant liability. Marcus waved dismissively. I've reviewed your so-called evidence. It's circumstantial at best, hardly worth derailing a multi-million-dollar transaction. He pulled out his phone, checking something on the screen. I've arranged for local counsel to take over the case. You're coming back to New York with me tonight. Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. You can't do that. I'm in the middle of complex negotiations. I can and I am. Marcus's smile was cold. Your little vacation is over, Sarah. Time to remember where your loyalties lie. Jake stepped forward, his presence suddenly intimidating despite his casual clothes. Excuse me, but I don't believe anyone asked for your opinion on how Miss Matthews conducts her business. Marcus finally looked at Jake, his expression disdainful. And you are? Someone who cares about seeing justice done, Jake replied evenly. Something you might not be familiar with. The tension between the two men was palpable. Sarah could see Marcus sizing Jake up, clearly finding him wanting based on his rural appearance. It was exactly the kind of prejudice that had always bothered Sarah about her professional world. Marcus, I need to speak with you privately, Sarah said, hoping to diffuse the situation before it escalated. They walked a short distance from Jake, who remained by the creek with his arms crossed and a dangerous expression on his face. Sarah, I'm going to be very clear, Marcus said in a low voice. Your career is hanging by a thread. The partners are already questioning your judgment after that incident with the Harrison case. If you don't come back with me today, don't bother coming back at all. Sarah felt a familiar fear grip her chest. the same panic that had controlled her decisions for years. Her career, her apartment, her entire identity was tied up in the law firm. Walking away would mean starting over with nothing. But as she looked back at Jake, still standing protectively near their picnic spot, she realized she had already started over. The work she was doing here mattered in ways her Manhattan cases never had. The person she was becoming in Cedar Ridge was someone she actually liked. "I understand your position," Sarah said carefully, "but I have ethical obligations to my client and to the court. I can't abandon this case in the middle of active litigation." Marcus's face reddened. "There is no litigation. There's a simple estate sale that you've complicated beyond all recognition." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "I know about your little romance with the local yokel. Don't let a cowboy fantasy destroy everything you've worked for." The crude dismissal of both Jake and her feelings sparked anger in Sarah's chest. "My personal life is none of your concern. Everything about you is my concern when it affects the firm's reputation." Marcus checked his watch impatiently. "You have 1 hour to pack your things. The plane leaves at 6. After Marcus stalked back to his rental car and drove away, Sarah returned to Jake, who was pacing beside the creek like a caged wolf. "I take it that didn't go well," he said. Sarah sank onto a fallen log, suddenly exhausted. "He's threatening to fire me if I don't return to New York tonight." Jake sat beside her, his presence steadying. "And what are you going to do?" Sarah looked out over the Heartfelt property, thinking about Thomas's grave, about the hawks nesting in the cottonwoods, about the community that was counting on her to protect their way of life. Then she thought about her empty apartment, her soul-crushing job, and the partnership she had once wanted so desperately. "I'm going to do something that probably makes no sense at all," she said finally. Jake's smile was soft. "Those are usually the best decisions." Sarah turned to face him fully. "Jake, if I fight this through to the end, I'll probably lose everything I've spent years building in New York. And if you go back?" Sarah considered the question honestly. "I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been." Jake reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture so tender it made Sarah's breath catch. "Then I guess the real question is whether you're brave enough to find out what might be." As the sun began to set over the Wyoming plains, Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. For the first time in years, she was ready to choose courage over safety, hope over certainty. "Jake," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do, "I think I'm going to need a good local lawyer." Jake's laugh was rich with joy and promise. "I think that can be arranged, counselor. I think that can definitely be arranged." Sarah stared at her laptop screen in the hotel lobby, reading the termination letter that had arrived in her email an hour after Marcus's plane departed. Effective immediately, her employment with Webb, Sterling and Associates was terminated for breach of contract and failure to fulfill professional obligations. Her access to firm resources was revoked, her cases reassigned, and her partnership track permanently discontinued. The words should have devastated her, but instead Sarah felt an unexpected sense of relief. The golden handcuffs were finally off. She closed the laptop and looked around the small lobby, noting how different it felt from the sterile corporate environments she had inhabited for so long. Jake pushed through the door, bringing the scent of fresh air and honest work. His expression darkened when he saw her face. "Bad news?" "Actually, I'm not sure." Sarah showed him the termination email. "I've officially been fired." Jake read over the formal language, his jaw tightening. "Are you okay?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "I think I'm better than okay. For the first time in years, I'm free to do what I think is right instead of what's profitable." "And what do you think is right?" "Fighting for Thomas Hartwell's real wishes, protecting this community, and making sure justice actually gets served." Sarah stood, feeling energy coursing through her veins. "Jake, I want to take this case pro bono. Not for the firm, not for my career, but because it matters." Jake's smile was brilliant. "There's just one problem, counselor. You're not licensed to practice law in Wyoming." Sarah's heart sank. In her emotional decision to stay and fight, she had forgotten the practical reality of state bar licensing. "You're right. I can't represent anyone here officially. But you could work as a legal consultant to a Wyoming attorney," Jake said thoughtfully. Someone who believes in the case and would be willing to let you do most of the heavy lifting. Do you know anyone like that? Jake's grin was mischievous. As a matter of fact, I do. My sister Jenny graduated from law school 3 years ago. She's been working for legal aid in Cheyenne, looking for a chance to take on something bigger. 2 days later, Jenny Morrison arrived in Cedar Ridge driving a motorcycle that was only slightly less battered than Jake's truck. She was younger than Sarah had expected, with Jake's same dark hair and determined chin, but there was a fierce intelligence in her eyes that reminded Sarah of herself at that age. "So you're the city lawyer who's got my brother all twisted up," Jenny said as they shook hands outside the diner. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm the lawyer who's trying to protect your community's interests." Jenny's laugh was warm. "Relax, I'm teasing. Jake told me what you've discovered about the Hartwell will. If you're right, this could be the case that puts our little practice on the map." "Your practice?" "Morrison and Associates," Jenny said proudly. "Established last week when I decided to hang out my own shingle. Jake's my first associate, though he doesn't know it yet." They spent the afternoon going through the evidence Sarah had compiled. Jenny's legal mind was sharp and creative, seeing angles that Sarah had missed in her focus on the will tampering. "The fraud is just the beginning," Jenny said, spreading documents across the table. "Look at the pattern of property acquisitions the development company has made over the past 2 years. They've been systematically buying up ranching land, always through intermediaries, always with rushed sales that didn't give communities time to organize opposition." Sarah studied the acquisition map Jenny had created. "You think this is part of a larger scheme? I think Cedar Ridge is just one stop on a development tour that's designed to transform this entire region." Jenny highlighted several properties on the map. Agricultural land gets rezoned for commercial use. Family ranches get broken up and sold. Communities lose their economic base and their identity. Jake leaned over the table, his expression grim. "And by the time people realize what's happening, it's too late to stop it." Sarah felt pieces clicking into place in her mind. That's why they were in such a hurry to close the Hartwell deal. They needed to establish a beachhead in this area before local opposition could organize. Exactly. Jenny pulled out another file. "I've been in contact with ranching families in 3 other counties. Same pattern, same developer, same law firm representing the buyers. Webb, Sterling, and Associates," Sarah said, her stomach sinking as she realized the implications. "Your old firm has been facilitating these deals for the past 18 months, Jenny confirmed, which means your former boss knew exactly what you had stumbled into when you started asking questions about the will." The betrayal was deeper than Sarah had imagined. Marcus hadn't just been protecting one problematic transaction. He had been safeguarding an entire network of questionable deals that could generate millions in legal fees for the firm. "We need to file injunctions in all the affected counties," Sarah said, her legal mind automatically shifting into battle mode. "Freeze any pending sales until we can investigate the pattern of fraud." Jenny nodded eagerly. "I've already started the paperwork, but Sarah, you need to understand what we're up against. The development company has unlimited resources and political connections. They'll throw everything they have at stopping us." Jake stood and walked to the window, looking out at the main street of his hometown. "Let them come. This is our home. We'll fight for it." That evening, Sarah called her former assistant in New York to arrange for her personal files to be shipped to Cedar Ridge. The conversation was awkward, with Linda clearly having been instructed not to provide any assistance to Sarah's new endeavors. "I'm sorry, Sarah, but Mr. Webb has made it very clear that any cooperation with your current activities would result in immediate termination," Linda said apologetically. "I have to think about my own job security." After hanging up, Sarah felt the weight of bridges burned behind her. She had no apartment to return to, no job waiting, no safety net except her own determination and the trust of people she had known for less than a week. Jake found her sitting on the hotel porch, staring up at the star-filled sky. "Having second thoughts?" "Third and fourth thoughts," Sarah admitted. "I've never taken on a case this big without firm backing, without resources, without a clear path to victory." Jake sat beside her, his shoulder brushing against hers. "But you're not backing down." It wasn't a question, and Sarah realized he was right. Despite the fear and uncertainty, she felt more committed to this fight than she had to anything in years. No, I'm not backing down. Good, because I have something that might help. Jake pulled a manila envelope from his jacket. I've been doing some investigating of my own. Turns out the development company's local representative, Peterson, has some interesting connections. Sarah opened the envelope and examined the documents inside. Bank records, property transfers, and corporate filings painted a picture of financial impropriety that went far beyond the Heartfelt will. Jake, where did you get these? Let's just say small towns have their advantages when it comes to information gathering. Jake's smile was mysterious. Peterson's been using insider knowledge to profit from the property deals he's facilitating. Classic breach of fiduciary duty. Sarah felt a familiar thrill as she recognized the legal implications. This gives us leverage. We can force him to cooperate with our investigation in exchange for not filing criminal charges. I was hoping you'd say that. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Jake spoke again. Sarah, I need to tell you something. These past few days working with you, watching you fight for people you barely know, it's made me realize something important. Sarah's heart began to race. What's that? Jake turned to face her fully. I'm falling in love with you. I know it's crazy, I know it's fast, but I can't deny what I'm feeling. The words hit Sarah like a physical force. She had been so focused on legal strategies and professional consequences that she had been trying to ignore the growing connection between them. But sitting here in the Wyoming darkness with Jake's honest eyes looking into hers, she couldn't pretend anymore. It is crazy, she said softly. And fast. And completely impractical. But, Jake prompted. Sarah reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. But I'm falling in love with you too. With this place, with this life, with the person I become when I'm here. Jake leaned closer, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. Then maybe crazy is exactly what we need. When he kissed her, Sarah felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of herself. This wasn't the careful, calculated romance she had always planned for her life. This was wild and unexpected and absolutely right. As they broke apart, both breathing hard, Sarah realized that she wasn't just fighting for Thomas Hartwell's legacy anymore. She was fighting for her own future, for the life she wanted to build in this place with this man. Jake, she whispered against his lips. Tomorrow we go to war. His smile was fierce and protective. Tomorrow we go to war. Tonight we remember what we're fighting for. The county courthouse in Cedar Ridge had never seen anything like the media circus that descended on it the morning of the hearing. News vans lined the street. Reporters interviewed locals about the David and Goliath battle between a small ranching community and a powerful development corporation. Sarah adjusted her borrowed blazer nervously as she walked up the courthouse steps beside Jenny Morrison. They had worked 18-hour days for the past week, preparing their case against an army of corporate lawyers who had flown in from Denver, Chicago, and New York. Remember, I'm lead counsel. You're my consultant, Jenny whispered as they entered the packed courtroom. If Judge Martinez asks you a direct question, I'll field it. Sarah nodded, though every instinct told her to take the lead. She had been arguing cases in courtrooms for 8 years, while Jenny was about to try her first major case. But Wyoming law was clear about who could represent clients in state court. Jake caught her eye from the gallery, where he sat with dozens of local ranchers and their families. His encouraging smile steadied her nerves. Over the past week, their relationship had deepened beyond the initial attraction. They had spent long evenings working side by side, sharing stories about their dreams and fears, building the foundation of something real and lasting. The development company's legal team filled 3 tables, led by a senior partner from one of Denver's most prestigious firms. Marcus Webb sat in the second row, his expression cold as he watched Sarah take her seat at the plaintiff's table. Judge Martinez called the court to order and reviewed the complex web of motions they were there to address. The primary question was whether to grant an injunction stopping the sale of the Heartfelt property, pending investigation of the will's validity. Secondary motions addressed fraud allegations, requests for document discovery, and demands for criminal referrals. Ms. Morrison, Judge Martinez said, you may present your opening statement. Jenny stood, her voice clear and confident despite her nervousness. Your Honor, this case is about more than one property sale. It's about a systematic pattern of fraud designed to steal the legacy of hardworking families and destroy the communities they've built over generations. She outlined their evidence methodically. The contradictions in the will documents, the suspicious timing of changes, the pattern of rushed sales across multiple counties. Sarah felt proud of her new partner's presentation, noting how effectively Jenny connected legal technicalities to human consequences. The defense attorney, a silver-haired man named Richardson, countered with arguments about the sanctity of contracts and the dangers of allowing emotional appeals to override legal documents. His presentation was polished but cold, exactly the kind of corporate advocacy Sarah had once delivered herself. Furthermore, Richardson continued, the plaintiff's case relies heavily on the unsupported theories of a disgraced attorney who was terminated for professional misconduct. His gaze landed meaningfully on Sarah. We question both the credibility and the motives of someone who has abandoned her professional obligations to pursue a personal vendetta. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but Jenny's hand on her arm kept her seated. This was exactly what they had expected, a personal attack designed to discredit their evidence by discrediting Sarah herself. Judge Martinez frowned at Richardson. Counselor, please confine your remarks to the legal issues at hand. Of course, Your Honor. I'm simply noting that the entire foundation of the plaintiff's case rests on allegations made by someone whose professional judgment is clearly compromised. Jenny stood for her rebuttal. Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself regardless of who discovered it. We have documentary proof of will tampering, witness testimony about fraudulent signatures, and a pattern of suspicious transactions that demands investigation. The morning was consumed by detailed presentations of evidence. Sarah provided whispered guidance to Jenny, helping her navigate objections and respond to the defense team's aggressive challenges. It was frustrating to sit silently, while others argued points she could have made more effectively. But she was impressed by Jenny's natural courtroom instincts. During the lunch recess, Peterson approached Sarah outside the courthouse. The development company's representative looked haggard, his usual confidence replaced by obvious anxiety. Ms. Matthews, could I speak with you privately? Sarah glanced at Jenny, who nodded. They followed Peterson to a quiet corner of the courthouse lawn, away from the reporters and spectators. I want to make a deal, Peterson said without preamble. What kind of deal? Jenny asked. Peterson pulled out his phone and showed them a series of text messages. These are communications between Marcus Webb and my company's executives. They prove that your former firm knew about the will discrepancies from the beginning and helped cover them up. Sarah's heart raced as she read the messages. Marcus hadn't just been protecting one transaction. He had been actively participating in the fraud, providing legal cover for a scheme that had been bilking rural communities for months. Why are you showing us this? Sarah asked. Peterson's laugh was bitter. Because I'm about to be thrown under the bus to protect people who are making 10 times what I am. These text messages prove that the decision to falsify the will came from Webb's office, not from me. I'm not going to prison to protect Marcus Webb's reputation. Jenny and Sarah exchanged glances. This was the break they had been hoping for, but it came with obvious risks. What do you want in exchange? Jenny asked. Immunity from prosecution in exchange for my full cooperation. I'll testify about how the fraud was organized, provide all the documents in my possession, and help you build cases against the other affected properties. Sarah studied Peterson's face, trying to gauge his sincerity. You understand that your testimony would destroy your career in real estate development? My career was destroyed the moment I got involved with these people, Peterson said. At least this way I can help make sure they don't hurt anyone else. The afternoon session began with a bombshell. Jenny announced that they had a new witness who would provide crucial testimony about the fraud allegations. Richardson objected strenuously, but Judge Martinez allowed Peterson to take the stand. Peterson's testimony was devastating. He described in detail how Marcus Webb had contacted him 6 months earlier with a proposal to expedite property acquisitions by streamlining the legal documentation. When Peterson had expressed concern about the ethics of altering wills, Marcus had assured him that such practices were common in complex estate cases. Mr. Webb told me that the important thing was achieving the deceased's general intent, not getting bogged down in legal technicalities, Peterson testified. He said that Thomas Hartwell clearly wanted his property sold, and the specific terms were less important than executing a clean transaction. Richardson's cross-examination was brutal, but Peterson held firm to his story. He produced text messages, emails, and recorded phone conversations that painted a clear picture of conspiracy between Webb's firm and the development company. During a brief recess, Sarah noticed Marcus Webb making urgent phone calls in the hallway. His face was pale, and she could see him gesturing angrily at whoever was on the other end of the line. The final witness of the day was Helen, the courthouse clerk who had processed the original will filing. Her testimony established that the document in the official file was not the same one Thomas Hartwell had signed in her presence. I remember Mr. Hartwell specifically mentioning the conservation clauses, Helen said. He was very proud of the provisions he had included to protect the land for future generations. When I saw the filed version later, I was confused about why those sections were missing. By the time closing arguments began, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Richardson's confident demeanor had given way to damage control, while Jenny presented their case with growing authority. Your Honor, Jenny concluded, the evidence is overwhelming. Thomas Hartwell's true wishes were subverted by a conspiracy designed to profit from the destruction of rural communities. We ask that you grant our injunction and refer this matter to the State Attorney General for criminal investigation. Judge Martinez retired to consider his decision, leaving both sides to wait in tense silence. Sarah found herself standing outside the courthouse with Jake, watching the sun set over the prairie. Whatever happens, I want you to know I'm proud of you, Jake said, taking her hand. You gave up everything to fight for people you barely knew. Sarah squeezed his fingers. I didn't give up everything. I found everything that actually matters. When Judge Martinez returned to the courtroom an hour later, his expression was grave. This case has presented troubling evidence of fraud and conspiracy that strikes at the heart of our legal system. I am granting the plaintiff's motion for a temporary injunction, stopping any sale of the Hartwell property pending further investigation. The courtroom erupted in cheers from the local supporters. Sarah felt tears of relief streaming down her face as Jenny grabbed her in a fierce hug. Furthermore, Judge Martinez continued, I am referring the evidence of document tampering and conspiracy to the Wyoming State Attorney General's Office for criminal investigation. The court finds probable cause to believe that serious crimes have been committed in connection with this case. As they left the courthouse, Sarah saw Marcus Webb surrounded by reporters, his face a mask of fury and defeat. Their eyes met across the crowd, and Sarah felt nothing but pity for the man who had once controlled her life with threats and intimidation. Jake swept her into his arms outside the courthouse, spinning her around as camera flashes went off around them. We did it, he whispered in her ear. We actually did it. Sarah laughed through her tears, feeling lighter than she had in years. We did it, she agreed. And this is just the beginning. That evening, the entire town gathered at Murphy's bar to celebrate the victory. Sarah found herself surrounded by ranchers and farmers who treated her like a conquering hero. But the moment that mattered most came when Jake pulled her aside and led her back to the creek where they had shared their first honest conversation. Sarah, he said, his voice serious in the moonlight, I know we've only known each other for 2 weeks, but these have been the most important 2 weeks of my life. Sarah's heart began to pound as she realized what was happening. Jake. He dropped to one knee, pulling out a simple silver ring that looked like it had been in his family for generations. I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I'm asking if you'll stay, if you'll build a life here with me, if you'll let me love you for the rest of our lives. Sarah looked down at Jake's hopeful face, then out at the land they had fought to protect, then back at the man who had shown her what love could really be. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Jake Morrison. I'll stay. I'll build a life here. I'll let you love me forever. As he slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her, Sarah realized that she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. Not just love, but home. Not just a career, but a calling. Not just a future, but a purpose worth fighting for. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of the renovated Hartwell farmhouse. watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across the valley. The house had been transformed from a dusty monument to the past into a warm, welcoming home that honored its history while embracing the future. Jake appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied smile of a man who had just finished the morning chores. "The contractors say they'll be done with the office addition by next week," he said, handing her a cup. "Morrison and Associates will finally have a proper headquarters." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, still marveling at how natural this domestic routine had become. "Jenny's excited about expanding the practice. We've got inquiries from 3 more counties about similar fraud cases." The criminal investigation into Marcus Webb and his co-conspirators had made national news, exposing a network of fraudulent property deals that stretched across 5 states. Webb was currently serving a 4-year sentence for conspiracy and fraud, while his law firm faced millions in civil penalties and professional sanctions. "Any regrets about not going after the big settlement offers?" Jake asked, settling beside her at the kitchen table they had found in an antique shop in Cheyenne. Sarah shook her head. "The Hartwell Trust is exactly what Thomas would have wanted. The conservation easement protects the sensitive areas, the limited development provides sustainable income for the community, and the educational center will teach people about ranch life and environmental stewardship." They had turned down several lucrative offers to settle the case quietly, instead working with community leaders to create a model for rural land preservation that was already being studied by policymakers across the country. A knock at the front door interrupted their peaceful morning. Sarah opened it to find a young woman in her 20s wearing a business suit and carrying a briefcase. "Ms. Matthews? I'm Rebecca Chen from the Environmental Law Institute. I've been following your work on rural land preservation, and I was wondering if you might have time to discuss a proposition." Over the next hour, Rebecca outlined an opportunity that would have thrilled the old Sarah. A prestigious environmental law organization in Washington, D.C., wanted to offer her a partnership position, leading their new Rural Communities Protection Initiative. The salary would be triple what she had made in New York, and the position would give her a national platform for the work she had pioneered in Wyoming. "It's a generous offer," Sarah said diplomatically, "but I'm very happy with my current situation." Rebecca looked confused. "Ms. Matthews, with all due respect, you could impact thousands of communities from Washington instead of just focusing on local cases here in Wyoming. Think of the scale you could achieve." After Rebecca left, Sarah found Jake in the barn, working on repairs to the old horse stalls. He looked up as she approached, reading her expression with the intuitive accuracy that still surprised her. "Big job offer?" he asked. Sarah told him about Rebecca's proposition, watching his face for any sign of pressure or expectation. Instead, she saw only gentle curiosity. "What did you tell her? That I was happy here?" "But Jake, she's not wrong about the impact I could have on a larger scale. I could help protect thousands of communities instead of just a few." Jake set down his hammer and gave her his full attention. "And what do you think?" Sarah had been asking herself the same question since Rebecca left. The old Sarah would have jumped at such an opportunity, would have seen it as validation of her worth and proof of her success. But the woman she had become over the past months had different priorities. "I think impact isn't just about scale," she said slowly. "I think it's about depth, about really knowing the people and places you're fighting for. In Washington, I'd be making policy for communities I'd never visited, protecting land I'd never walked." Jake's smile was soft with understanding. "And here? Here, I know every family that's affected by our cases. I know the history of the land, the ecology of the watersheds, the economic pressures the ranchers face." Sarah moved closer to Jake, drawn by his quiet strength. "Here, I'm not just practicing law. I'm part of a community." Jake reached up to cup her face gently. "But if you want to go, if you think it's the right opportunity—" "I don't," Sarah said firmly. 6 months ago, I thought success meant climbing higher on someone else's ladder. Now I know it means building something meaningful with people you love." That afternoon, Sarah called Rebecca to formally decline the position. As she hung up, she felt not disappointment but relief. She was exactly where she belonged. Jenny arrived that evening with takeout from the diner and news about their latest case. A family ranch in Colorado was facing a situation similar to the Hartwell case, and they wanted Morrison and Associates to represent them. It would mean travel, maybe a month or 2 in Colorado, Jenny explained as they ate on the farmhouse porch. But the legal precedents we set there could protect dozens of other ranches. Sarah felt excitement building in her chest. This was the kind of work that mattered, the perfect balance between local impact and broader significance. When do we start? The next morning, Sarah woke before dawn to find Jake already dressed and heading out for the early chores. She pulled on jeans and boots, following him to the barn where the horses waited for their morning feed. "I've been thinking about something," Jake said as they worked side by side, the comfortable rhythm of shared tasks making conversation easy. "What's that?" "When we get married, I want to do it right here, by Emma's grave under the cottonwoods." Sarah's hands stilled on the feed bucket. They had been engaged for 3 months, but they hadn't discussed specific wedding plans. "Why there?" Jake leaned against a stall door, his expression thoughtful. "Because that's where this whole thing started, where you first understood what this land means to people. And because Emma would have liked you, she would have been proud that her husband's wishes were finally honored." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Jake Morrison, how did I get so lucky as to fall in love with you?" His answer was a kiss that tasted like coffee and promises. Deep and sure and absolutely right. 2 weeks later, on a perfect September morning when the cottonwoods were just beginning to turn gold, Sarah found herself walking down a makeshift aisle toward the man who had changed her entire understanding of what life could be. Jenny served as her maid of honor, wearing a dress she had bought in Cheyenne and boots that were definitely not designed for wedding attire. Jake's best man was his ranch foreman, Tom, a weathered cowboy who had known Jake since he was a boy and had never been more proud. The entire community had turned out for the ceremony, filling folding chairs arranged in semicircles around Emma's grave. Sarah wore her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to fit by the town seamstress, and carried wildflowers picked that morning from the meadow where she and Jake had shared their first honest conversation. Pastor Williams from the local church performed the ceremony. His words simple and heartfelt. "Marriage is about more than love," he said, looking out at the assembled crowd. "It's about choosing to build a life together, to face whatever comes with faith in each other and commitment to something bigger than yourselves." When Jake spoke his vows, his voice was steady, and when Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Jake drew Sarah close by the waist, his arms encircling her completely. The kiss they shared was witnessed by the entire community that had adopted Sarah as one of their own, applauded by people whose lives had been changed by her courage. As they broke apart, Jake murmured against her ear, his voice carrying a promise and a tease. "Next time you leave, you're taking me along," Sarah laughed, remembering how terrified she had been just months earlier of staying in one place, of committing to anything permanent. "I'm not going anywhere, cowboy. This is home." That evening, as the reception wound down and the last of the guests headed home across the prairie, Sarah and Jake stood together on the farmhouse porch, looking out at the land they had fought to protect and would spend their lives nurturing. "Any second thoughts?" Jake asked, his arm around her waist. Sarah considered the question seriously. She thought about the life she had left behind in New York, the partnership she had abandoned, the safe and predictable future she had traded for this uncertain adventure. "Not one," she said, turning in his arms to face the man who had become her anchor and her freedom all at once. "Not a single one." Above them, the Wyoming stars blazed in an endless sky, bearing witness to a love that had grown from conflict into partnership, from attraction into commitment, from 2 separate lives into one shared journey. And in the distance, the wind carried the sound of cattle settling for the night, the eternal rhythm of a land that had finally found the protectors it deserved. Sarah Matthews Morrison had come to Wyoming to execute a simple legal transaction. Instead, she had found her calling, her home, and the great love of her life. In choosing to fight for a dead man's wishes, she had discovered her own dreams. In defending a community she barely knew, she had found the place where she truly belonged. The city girl had become a rancher's wife, but more than that, she had become exactly who she was always meant to be.